Joining us now on the line from New York, New York, Isobel Coleman, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Isobel, it's good to have you back on the program again. How are you tonight?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. I want to start by just having our director, Michael Smith, roll some video, and then we're going to talk about this. This is rather disturbing, so we warn people at home, if kids are near the TV set, you may not want to let them watch this. Roll tape, please.
Egyptian women have led a rally in Cairo against the army's treatment of female protesters. Hundreds took to the streets, demanding that the military be held accountable for their abuse of women. On Saturday, a woman was stripped and badly beaten by Egyptian security forces.
It is that last part there in particular that has caused quite a stir around the world. That was roughly 1 month ago, Isobel, that footage was shown. I'd like to know off the top, how common is what we saw in that video today in Egypt?
Well, I think it happens more often than we know. I mean, we've seen incidences of this making headlines, but I think women are harassed on a daily basis. They're harassed by the police. They're harassed by the security forces, the military. They're told that they don't belong in Tahrir Square. They're told that they are that they're not nice girls for being out protesting. They're really put under a different spotlight than men are as protesters. Harassment of women is not an uncommon occurrence in Egypt, just in everyday life too. Women get harassed walking down the street by men. So there's a lot of harassment of women that does go on.
In that last shot, there was somebody on the ground, a woman wearing a blue bra, who has suddenly become iconic. She's called the Blue Bra Girl now, and there was a piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago by David Kirkpatrick who wrote this: "Even when women have pushed back, as they did late last month in an historic march by thousands through downtown Cairo, many carrying pictures of, quote, the Blue Bra Girl, they have done so only with the protection of men. Men encircled the marchers, and at times those male guardians seemed to direct the crowd or lead its chants. Many chants, led by women, called for more gallantry from Egyptian men." And I wonder what you think the consequences are of Egyptian women depending too heavily on men, even when they're protesting.
Well, let me say that article stirred quite an outcry among women in Egypt who really resented the idea that they were portrayed in this way as being completely beholden to men for everything that they're doing. And a lot of women have put themselves out there without men protecting them. They have been on the front lines of demonstrations with men behind them, and they really, really resented that article and that piece, as if the only role for women is to be somehow their honor protected by men, and with men showing gallantry. So I think that article really hit a nerve on multiple levels. The fact is that women have marched on their own in Cairo. They have suffered the consequences of that, of being out there on their own. They've had men marching alongside with them. They have really tried to make it a more sort of engendered affair, but you still do see big differences and a gulf of different perspectives between men and women in that country, and it has come out on the streets of Cairo in different ways. There was a protest last March on International Women's Day. It was soon after the revolution had started, and women took to the streets to really bring attention to women's issues. And there were angry men there who threw stones at them and shouted names at them and told them to get out of there, and said that, you know, focusing on women's rights, it wasn't the right time, that they were pushing the wrong issues, and it was very, very divisive. So you've seen men not behave very gallantry towards women in a gallant fashion, and you've also seen women taking a lot of initiative and being very courageous on their own.
Well, let's do some comparing and contrasting. When you were on this program a year ago, when we were talking about the events of Tahrir Square and all of the women that seemed to be not just demonstrating, but in many cases leading the demonstrations, you did tell us that you didn't think that they were specifically demonstrating about women's rights, that it was bigger than that. Do you think that's changed now, a year later?
Well, I think that they are still demonstrating about something bigger, which is freedom and liberty. But liberty and freedom includes women's rights. And I think the women themselves, they have changed their agenda a bit, because they've seen how what they presumed to be some sense of gender equality between men and women out there in Tahrir Square and the protest movement really dissolve under the pressures of the past year. And I mentioned this International Women's Day march that ended in violence and the women being harassed. You've had women protesters be picked up out of Tahrir Square by the military and subjected to virginity tests. I mean, how humiliating is that? You've had people calling for women to quiet down, to put women's issues at the side. You've had people cheering the military for imposing these virginity tests on women. So you've seen it very divisive in society. And I think it's made a lot of women realize, wow, there is a set of issues that is specific to women and that does need to be out in front. So even though today I would say women are still protesting for justice, for freedom, for democracy, for bigger issues, women's rights and women's issues are very much a part of that for some group of those women.
Now, of course, they've just had parliamentary elections. They've chosen a new parliament. Women are dramatically less represented in this new parliament than they were in the last one. And as many as 70% of the seats in the new parliament are taken up by, I guess, many of the much more Islamist groups that want to roll back women's rights. Can you paint us a bit of a picture of what some of, moving the clock backwards might include?
Yeah. Well, the last parliament under Mubarak, there were 64 women in that parliament, and they were there under a quota system that Mubarak instituted. And many of those seats, overwhelmingly so, went to his own party, the National Democratic Party, the NDP. And women's role in that parliament was resented as just being a token, as being handpicked by Mubarak there to just parrot what the Mubarak regime wanted them to say. This time around, there was no quota for women. They asked each of the parties to have women on their lists, but they did that in different ways. Most of the parties put women at the bottom of their list so that they really were not in a viable position to be elected. There were a couple parties that did put women near the top, some of the liberal parties, but overall women were very much at the bottom of the lists. There were a couple parties, the Salafi parties, who protested the very idea of having women run for office. They say it's against Islam, they shouldn't be out there. They did put women on their list just to abide by the letter of the law, but they protested that specific act. The women who ran on some of these conservative Salafi lists would not show their faces. They had a little flower as a picture instead to signify their candidacy. Now, there have been 8 women elected. About half of them are from the Muslim Brotherhood, but these women are not wallflowers. Most of them have some significant political experience. They're very ardent about their role in Parliament, about the need for women to be very much a part of this new government, of women's rights. They want to talk about it. They're pushing it forward. But how they define women's rights will really differ across the more liberal candidates, the liberal parliamentarians and the Islamists. You've already had some of the Islamist women in Parliament saying, while we push for women's rights and women to participate in politics, we take issue with certain laws on the books that relate to the family law that we want to change, that we think go against the Sharia. And this is a preview for what's going to come in Egypt.
Do you think that with the revolution has come an opening up of Egyptian politics, and with that, a revitalization of the women's movement in Egypt? Is that fair to say?
Well, I hope that's true. There's certainly been an opening up of politics. Absolutely. You've had a flowering of political parties. You've had much more engagement by people. Average Egyptians now really engaged, much higher levels of voting and voter participation, and people really trying to understand what's going on politically. Has this revitalized a women's movement? Perhaps. You've certainly seen the clip that you showed, really, of that brutal beating of that woman last month in December, really angered people in Egypt. And you had the largest demonstration, women's demonstration, with men, by the way, out there demonstrating alongside them, by some estimates, the largest demonstration since 1919, when women took to the streets to protest against British rule. So in that sense, you've seen an unprecedented mobilization of women in recent decades that has occurred. But you've also seen a divisiveness in society, with some groups lining up saying, you know, we want to get rid of these laws that have been imposed on us by the illegitimate Mubarak regime. They call them Suzanne's laws, after First Lady Suzanne Mubarak, and paint them with an air of illegitimacy, that they somehow are very secular laws that were imposed by the Mubarak regime at the behest of the West, and that they undermine the family. They're painted in this way, in a very negative way. And you have many factions in Egypt today that are lining up to roll those laws back. And these are laws that really pertain to people's everyday lives. They regulate divorce and marriage and custody and inheritance, things that really touch people quite personally and could actually set women's rights back in those areas. On the other hand, you do have this mobilization of women. You have a young generation of women who feel very much a part of the making of their new country and are determined to be at the forefront of change.
Okay, but I think I hear you saying things are not progressing as well or as quickly as you and many others wish they would in Egypt. And I wonder, as you cast your glance across the Middle East, if there's another Arab country that you think is making better and swifter progress on these things we've been talking about.
Well, Tunisia has always been at the forefront of women's rights in the region, and I think you see it again in the way that they've handled their election. They did have a quota for women. They instituted an electoral law that required that every party that was running in the election alternate a man and a woman on the list. So if they elected more than one person, it was bound to be a woman elected, and you ended up having some, quarter of the parliament today is now female in Tunisia, which is a higher percentage than it is here in the United States. And you've had Islamists gain a plurality again in Tunisia, as they have in other countries that are undergoing this process of change, Egypt in particular. But the Islamist party, the Ennahda party in Tunisia, is saying that we really want to not focus on women's rights in a bad way. We don't want to undermine women's rights. We acknowledge that women's rights are a part of the fabric of society today in Tunisia. They're very important economic actors, and we're really determined to see them as part of the ongoing changes in that country. So I think, again, you're going to see women in Tunisia not lose ground and perhaps even gain quite a lot in this new political system that is emerging there.
Well, again, let's do some more comparing and contrasting. If we're saying that Egypt is not doing as well as Tunisia, is it doing better than, say, some other more conservative Arab countries in the Middle East? And let's just pull Saudi Arabia out of the hat there. How are they doing compared to that?
Well, it all depends where you start from. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a country where women have the fewest rights of women in any country in the world. So relative to that, yes, I mean, Egypt is starting at a higher level, and I hope we'll continue to move forward. In Saudi, you have seen some positive changes for women, but again, you're starting from a place where women are not allowed to drive. They're not allowed to conduct most daily aspects of life without the permission of a man. The king just announced that women would be allowed to vote, but not in the election that was just held. It won't come to fruition for probably another 4 or 5 years until the next election is held, and who knows what's going to happen between now and then. Women were very excited at reaching this milestone, at being given the right to vote, even though it won't occur until some years forward, but that is a big step. But you're starting from a place where it is a much lower legal rights for women in that country than in other places. So, it's all relative.
And in my last 20 seconds here, Isobel, since we had so much coverage of Libya, a few months ago when Gaddafi was in the midst of being taken down, give us a word about Libya. How are women doing there?
Well, Libya is a much more mixed picture. The very first press conference that the transitional government held after Gaddafi was killed was to say, hey, this is the new Libya. We're going to be an Islamic state, and guess what? We're bringing back polygamy. And the men were there in the crowd. They were firing their guns in the air and cheering, and the women were pretty stony-faced, looking at this, saying, is this what we fought for, really? And this is going to be a friction point, women's rights, in that new society. They have a new election law that's being considered right now. The draft had a 10% quota for women. And there's talk right now, just in the last couple of days, that they're going to eliminate that quota so that there won't be any definite participation level for women in the new government. Libya is a very wealthy country, and you will see many conservative factions lining up to really use that money to put women back in the home. On the other hand, you have some very educated and determined women in Libya who I think don't want to see that outcome, and this will be a friction point as the country emerges.
Isobel Coleman, always appreciate your visits here on TVO. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.